Hello. Om Lalitambikaye Namaha. So I'm continuing reading from the new Shri Vidya book. If you want to purchase the book, there's a link in the description of the video. So today we're going to finish my preface to the book and discuss that a little bit. Even the tradition of constructing temples is not Vedic in origin. It is a modern practice derived from the Tantric Agamas. In the Vedic times, after a ritual was completed, the temporary structure built for the ritual was burned as a final offering to Agni. People did not need stone structures to let them know which place was sacred. They could tell if a place was sacred and gravitated to such places naturally. Now we must build elaborate and beautiful buildings and install icons of the devas to allow people to become aware that spiritual beings are blessing humanity from that location. When special festivals are held, flags are raised on the temple flagpoles to alert people that this is a sacred time when blessings will be abundant. None of this was necessary in Vedic times. Nearly every major religious custom and tradition now has its roots in Tantra. Through the Tantras, we remain connected to the Vedic tradition. But the Vedic tradition is no longer in practice. The same truth proclaimed by Vedas is the essence of Tantra. The techniques are different, but the aspiration is the same. Tantra can be a difficult subject to write about because it has become connected in people's minds to politics and religion. These are two subjects about which people are very passionate. People do not tend to be calm or rational about such subjects. The Orthodox have their thoughts on the subject. The heterodox also have their own unique views. The Western scholars have certain ideas, as do the Eastern practitioners. The Western New Age movement, which has appropriated many important concepts and sacred symbols of Shri Vidya, also has its own views on the subject. Everyone has certain preconceived notions by which they remain bound, and there is not much agreement. It is not an easy job working to inspire people toward liberation. If only it were easy for people to realize that they alone are the source of their own suffering. It takes much grace to realize this. A person has to come to the painful realization that they themselves have been the only obstacle in their own path. Then they have to work to overcome their attachments and limitations. This work is not easy. It requires sincerity, patience, and persistence. For a long time, the practice will not yield any noticeable results. We can tell that a person is completely ignorant when, after a few months or years of spiritual practice, they claim that the practice has awakened them and freed them from what had been binding them. This is wishful thinking. For true progress, in most cases, many years of sustained effort are required. We live in a time of modern conveniences and instant gratification. People have no value for things which do not produce instantaneously perceivable results. Spirituality, for most people, has become another form of materialism under the guises of something otherworldly. Many people are doing spiritual practice only for the worldly benefits that they believe that it may grant them. Few have patience for the time-tested ways of our ancestors. Few can truly appreciate the wisdom of the ancient traditions of faith. Having not seen the miracles described by the scriptures, people easily discount the tradition or turn it into something else which they claim produces some result that they can easily perceive. The logical mind struggles with the philosophy of Shri Vidya. Shri Vidya points toward higher truth, but people are very caught in ignorance and have little desire for truth. It is the nature of the ego to deny truth. Yet, for a few, this text will serve as a source of inspiration for their practice to transcend what has bound them. This text is offered for those rare souls and to honor the sacred tradition of Tantra, which has suffered many insults over the past 2 centuries. For me, this is not an intellectual, political, or religious subject. It is not theoretical or intellectual, but very pragmatic. It is a path which I have walked with my masters, a path which has shown me mystical things more beautiful than I could have possibly imagined. It has given me attainments greater than I could have fathomed to be possible. It has shown me darkness surrounding myself and led me to awareness of the light of the self beyond. The light of the self shines in each and every soul with a radiance brighter than 1,000 suns. It is an often quoted assertion from the scriptures. For me, it is not merely assertion, it is my experience. For others to see this light, it is necessary first to look at the darkness within themselves. This darkness also is many times greater than they can easily fathom. It takes greater courage and diligent effort to wade through the darkness within oneself. I owe everything to the grace of my masters, which has illuminated the truth of the scriptures. It is my humble desire to honor the tradition which has brought me so much and to share its light with those who humbly seek something greater. Look within yourself. The goddess is in you and in everything around you also. She is veiled by many layers of repressed thoughts and feelings, and by many misconceptions. These can only be removed by sitting still and witnessing them pass. There is no shortcut on this path. It is a path of practice. It requires a lot of effort, but this effort is indeed worthwhile. Eventually, it leads us to become free from everything that binds us. Liberation is brought about by knowledge. Stop studying books. Stop studying the world around you. Instead, study yourself. Your own mind is the most profound book. It cannot be understood by simply thinking. To understand the mind, you must observe it like a scientist in a laboratory observing the results of an experiment. Excuse me. Only by observing the mind can we come to know its true nature. Most of the capacity of the mind remains dormant for most people. The mind has great abilities beyond the intellect. For the person who really knows themselves, they will know all the universe as well. Yourself pervades all of creation. It is greater than anything you can imagine. It cannot be understood. Become still, and you will see directly the essence of Tantra, which is essentially the essence of yourself and everything that is. It is the supreme goddess who is praised by the ancient sages, with love and respect for all people of all traditions. For the benefit of all living beings, I offer these teachings on Shri Vidya. Some people are teaching and practicing differently. I can only advocate what my masters have taught me. Hopefully, a little of their immense knowledge and wisdom will carry through this text for the benefit of others. Gananathamritananda Giri, Schuyler, Virginia, October 2023. So I wrote that last year, just in time. We rushed to get this book completed and sent off to the printer in time for the Navaratri celebration, the 9-night festival of the goddess last year, 2023. The goddess tradition is underrepresented. In the world today, many of the goddess traditions have been wiped out. Many of the pre-Christian traditions had goddesses. It wasn't considered only appropriate to pray to the Lord as a divine father. Many of the traditions welcome people to look to God as a divine mother. Of course, God has no gender. The divine is beyond these human qualities like gender. Mm. We talk about Shiva Shakti, divine masculine, divine feminine, but Shiva is not a man and Shakti is not a woman. It's a goddess far beyond. But we've really lessened the idea of what goddess is. Society has been run by men. Of course, I'm drawn to these goddess traditions. I've got the moon in my first house in Cancer in my birth chart. Of course, I'm drawn to the goddess. And Jupiter is there also in Cancer in the first house. Of course, my Ishta Devata is going to be the goddess. I love my mother, and I love the Divine Mother. It's very easy for me to approach the divine as a divine feminine, as a mother, because I love my mother. I'm a mama's boy. But a lot of women also may find it easy to approach a divine mother. But the men of the world have said these goddess traditions are bad, and almost every goddess tradition has been wiped out in the world, except for a few. Maybe the Taoists pray to some goddesses, maybe Shintos, the Buddhists, and the Hindus. But there was a major effort in India. We've got to remember, major effort to wipe out the goddess tradition. And there was a lot of influence there. And still, they're trying to convince us that the goddess tradition has been wiped out. Look at a site like Wikipedia, supposed to be unbiased encyclopedia. It will tell us only about 2% of the Hindus in India are Shaktas, goddess-worshipping Hindus. When in reality, almost every family in South India has a Kula Devi, a family goddess. There's Grama Devis, goddess of the village, the town where people live. Everyone's praying to goddesses. All the Shaivas pray to goddesses. If you pray to Shiva, you pray to Shakti. You're worshiping goddess Shakti and celebrating Navaratri. The Shaiva, the Vaishnavas also, they pray to goddesses. We have Bhudevi, Lakshmi Devi, Padmavati. If we pray to Krishna, there's Radha. If we pray to Rama, there's Sita. All of the traditions are honoring the divine feminine. They're all, in a sense, Shakta traditions. And all the traditions tell us that the divine feminine alone has the power. And that the gods are Purusha, they're beings, they're consciousness, but they're impotent to act without the Shakti of their goddess counterpart. It's never just Vishnu, it's Vishnu Lakshmi, Brahma Saraswati, Shiva Parvati. But we're led to believe that there are very many Vaishnavas, very many Shaivas, and very few Shaktas. And the Shakta tradition that there is has been put down because the first people going to translate the Vedas were the Christian missionaries sent by the crown of Europe, coming to convert people to Christianity. I think I mentioned last time that in the circles of Indiologists, in the Western academic circles, I have a friend, an associate, who's written some wonderful books, translations of Bhagavad Gita. I think he's working on translation of Yoga Sutras now, with trying to put a very traditional sense, of traditional meaning there, because he's a devotee. He's been practicing for years. And he says he teaches at a university, teaches about Sanskrit and Hinduism. He's a Western-born guy, but he's a practitioner. He's a Hindu. And he says that within those academic circles, it's looked down upon very much to be a Hindu. So it's a strange thing when we find that in the academic circles, practitioners are not welcome. Hindus are not welcome to talk about Hinduism in the academic circles. And I noticed years ago on Wikipedia, many of the articles on Hinduism and on the different practices connected to Vedas on the Ayurveda, Vedic astrology, even on the history of India. A lot of these articles, Indian people are not allowed to comment. The Indian people often have a very different idea of the history in particular. Think about Dwaraka. Dwaraka is the city where Krishna lived, and we have some traditional sort of dates in the scriptures in Mahabharata. And some archaeologists in India found a submerged city off the coast of Gujarat that they think is Dwaraka. And they carbon dated it, and it carbon dates to 9,000 years ago. If you look at Wikipedia and other sources like this, they'll tell us that Krishna lived 150 years before Christ. This is based upon the timeline that was set by these early Christian missionaries. It wasn't based upon science. We have a scientific understanding that the earth is very old now. But it was based upon the concept of time that they created by following the genealogy of the Christian Bible. They said that we know Jesus's father was Joseph, and Joseph's father was this, and his father was this, and it goes back to Abraham, goes back to Noah, goes back to Moses, goes back to all these people. Who's the first man? Goes back to Adam. And so they reasoned that if, we know when Jesus lived, and we know his father, his father, his father, all these men, they could have lived for 100 years at best. They created a timeline saying the world started 4,000 years ago or something like this, based upon the genealogy of the Bible. But maybe they're taking the Bible too literally. Maybe in earlier times people lived for longer. We don't know. I don't mean to say the Bible is untrue. I mean to say that people are maybe processing all that too literally. They're analyzing it intellectually when there's a spiritual teaching being given. So they set the time of the world at too recent, and so they have trouble to believe that Vedas are as old as they are. And they know Vedas are the oldest because in the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about Vedas. So they know Vedas they predate the Gita. And so they set the date of Vedas at some time, then they set the date of Gita, and they'll say it's a century and a half before the birth of Christ. And of course, they reference it at birth of Christ, BC, before Christ. Of course, the more proper way to say it, BCE, before Common Era. But these scholars, a lot of them, they're Christian, and they have a desire to convert the people. They have a desire to put down the Hindu tradition. Some of the big Indiologists now in America who are trending on social media and have a lot of followers are very down on Hinduism. They're praising the Mughal, the Muslim rulers who came and invaded and did terrible atrocities in India. They're praising these guys, and they're putting down the Hindu people. And they're gaining a lot of following on social media by saying controversial things. They'll call Hindu people cow piss drinkers and things like this, which is terrible. But when you look, some of these Indiologists who are supposed to be teaching us in an unbiased way the history about India, about the tradition, they don't really know anything about the tradition. And they're coming from a perspective of looking down upon the tradition. Some of them, they have connections to people who are working in India today to convert people to Christianity. They have connections to Christian missionaries in India. So it's still very biased, and the Indian people are shut out. I was looking years ago at the Ayurveda articles on Wikipedia, and they're very quick in their articles on Ayurveda to say that this is pseudoscience. They used to be saying that it was a conspiracy theory. That wording has been removed now. But at the time that I saw that, I got very concerned, and I said, this is extremely biased. Let me see if we can edit this, because everything has to have a reference. Everything has to be factual here, or it should be. And I found that not only were Indian people blocked from commenting upon the section on Ayurveda on Wikipedia, but everyone was blocked from editing it because too many people had been trying to change these wrong facts that were put in, so-called facts. So the timeline is very different, you know. They carbon dated Dwaraka to 9,000 years before today. But Wikipedia will say, oh, well, there's evidence maybe it's 150 years before Christ. So about 2,000 years ago, 2,000, few hundred years. So they're not even looking at science. They discount the people of the culture and the tradition. They're trying to put it down. This is the way that the pre-Christian traditions in Europe were demonized. You know, they said, this is pagan. This is polytheism. It's paganism. And they used the same trick with Hinduism. They said, oh, well, this is a polytheism. But Hinduism is not a polytheism. The Shaktas believe in one goddess. The Shaivas believe in one god, Shiva. Everything comes from Shiva. The Vaishnavas believe in one god. Everything comes from Vishnu. Even the Smartas believe in one god. You can choose between 5 names for this god. You can call him Surya. You can call him Ganapati. You can call him Devi, Vishnu, Shiva. You can choose. You could even call him Murugan if you're in South India. But there's only one God that everything comes from, and that's the same that we're taught in Vedas. Everything comes from Brahman. What's this? This potu, this bindi, this bindu. It's the dot. It's the symbol of the one formless Lord that from which everything springs forth. In the middle of every yantra, there's a bindu. On the forehead of every Hindu person, there's a bindi, this dot. It's the symbol of the one God that everything comes from. So how can we say this is a polytheism? Sure, there are devas, just like there are angels and archangels in the Christian tradition. We have devas and mahadevas, same, basically. Maybe there's a little bit different theology, but it doesn't mean that it's a polytheism. But they use that word because then they can say, our God is better, your gods are bad, you're not following the one true God. They demonized the pre-Christian traditions of Europe. And now, you know, I think this is very interesting karma. I went to a farmer's market recently, and there was a witch there selling potions to curse your enemy, right? Interesting. This couldn't have happened 10 years ago even. She wouldn't have been allowed to come. But now it's trending. It's popular. People want to go back to the pre-Christian tradition. But there's no connection to the highest light of God. Those channels have been closed that had been opened by the serious spiritual seekers in those traditions. And there's no traditional account. All we have is the account of the Christian missionaries who tried to demonize the tradition. They said this tradition is evil. They said that they're hurting people. They're sacrificing babies, sacrificing people. They're hurting people. They do black magic. They're invoking demons to hurt people. And now people have come to believe that that was the pre-Christian tradition. And so the great-great-great-granddaughters of these Christian missionaries who said bad things about that tradition now, in an effort to go back to their ancestral roots, are embracing the lies that were told by the Christian missionaries. And they're going now to farmers markets and making black magic potions and selling it to people. This is a very ironic return of karma, if you ask me. This is the same techniques that was used by the missionaries throughout the world. They try to put down the traditions. There's increasing scholarship out of India saying that this caste system, the corruption of the caste system in India that we see today, discrimination, abuse, all these kind of things, this wasn't a Vedic tradition. It was not of much importance in Vedas at all. This was something that was introduced first by the Muslims and then by the Christians who invaded India. There's increasing scholarship out of India telling us that the sati, the killing of the widows, was greatly exaggerated, that it was not really happening very often in India, but they said it was happening. So a lot of misconceptions are still there. You know, there are people in the West and there are people in India, Christians in India, still trying to teach Hindu people the misconceptions about their own traditions. They're trying to demonize the tradition. And they're having some amount of success. If we go to South America, think of what they've told us about the Inca people, the Aztecs. They say they were sacrificing people. I don't know if I believe that. I've looked at some of their iconography, their religious images, and we see images of cutting off the head. As a Hindu, I think of images of Kali Devi. Or what about goddess Chinnamasta? She's cutting off her own head. The loss of the head is a symbol of relieving oneself of the ego, releasing egoism. But of course, you know, if you want to demonize a tradition, you can look at that and say, oh, well, they're sacrificing people to their gods, so this is an evil tradition. And so they've made claims like this about the Hindu tradition. And so a lot of people now, they have a bad thought about Tantra and a bad thought about the Shakta traditions. And even a lot of the Shaktas have embraced some dark practices. They're doing more animal sacrifices for the goddess in Nepal, in North India, in South India, than many of the other deities. Probably the goddess is getting more terrible animal sacrifices. And the more black magic is happening in the name of these traditions. Why? Because they've been demonized. It was a thought of Western men to put down this tradition of the goddess. But the great tradition of Shakta Hinduism is still alive. It's still a part of the Shaiva traditions and the Vaishnava traditions and the Smarta tradition. And it exists on its own also, more than they tell us that it does. The archaeologists don't really know. They're thinking about religious, spiritual concepts. They don't really know. And, you know, part of it, it's just egoism. It's very hard for people to understand truly the spiritual concepts. If they've not seen the spiritual truth, then they don't know. They're bound by the senses of the mind and the body. They're bound by the intellect of the mind, the senses of the body. And that's how they process. That's how they understand. How can they understand subtler things that they've not seen? They can't really understand. So, of course, when the archaeologists go to a religious site, they may get confused and not understand what they're seeing. I do think in 2,000 years, if Christianity is not still very popular, that some archaeologists are going to dig up a buried church and they're going to find the images of Jesus on the cross, and they won't understand the concept of sacrifice. They're going to say, oh, well, Christianity was evil because they were sacrificing people to Jesus. They would pin them to the cross as an offering to Jesus. That's what they've done with the images of Hinduism. That's what they've done with the images of the pre-Christian traditions in Europe, of the South American traditions, of the traditions of Africa. They say it's black magic. The native traditions of Australia, they say the Aboriginal people there are doing black magic, that they're mean, bad people. I don't believe any of that. I think all of these were very pure spiritual traditions at one point connected to the highest light. The greatness of the Hindu tradition, though, is that it still remains as a living tradition of the goddess today. In a man's world that has tried to put down the divine feminine, it has remained. So that's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's our connection. If people want to try to reconnect to the earlier traditions that have been lost from pre-Christian Europe, they need to go through a living tradition of the goddess, like the Shakta tantric tradition, which is still living in India, that my teachers passed on to me. There are many teachers for it still. Some may be harder to find. But, you know, so it's a difficult subject to write about. People have a lot of misunderstanding, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just plain and simple facts here. You know, some of the reasoning for all the Ayurveda being misunderstood, misrepresented on supposedly unbiased sources like Wikipedia, some of this just has to do with who's publishing the texts on Western medicine. Since the time of Rockefeller, since the time of Andrew Carnegie, who has been funding the medical schools, who has been funding the medical studies, the medical journals, the pharmaceutical industry. And so, of course, it helps sell more products to say that herbs have no healing properties. They'll say there's no scientific studies that prove that any herb has a healing property, but there are scientific studies. In India, there are many studies, but they'll discount this. They'll say that Indian people are not up to the standard of science, that it's quasi-scientific. This is just racism. There's studies out of Germany. In Germany, for example, many herbs have been approved by the Western doctors to be prescribed to treat certain conditions. But it's not those sources who are writing about Ayurveda. They're pulling from the Western medical texts funded by the pharmaceutical companies. So some of it is greed, some of it is egoism, some of it is plain ignorance. We can't expect everyone to understand a truly mystical spiritual tradition. And we shouldn't expect everyone to understand. We don't need to convince anybody. Souls are all evolving at their own pace, from their own level of ignorance to knowledge and wisdom. There's some very young souls who are very ignorant. We'll never convince them of the truth. It's a waste of time to even try. Tiruvalluvar said, to speak truth to an idiot is like pouring pure amrita, nectar, into a gutter. It's foolish. Don't try to speak truth to a foolish person. They won't be able to understand. It doesn't matter. We don't need to convince everybody. People will learn in time according to their ability. We don't need to argue. We don't need to fight. We don't need to convince anybody. That's a problem in religion today. It's good there's so many traditions throughout the world representing the light of the divine, because then people from different cultures can approach in the way that is best for them. It's good that there's Shakta traditions, goddess traditions, because then those like myself who are inclined to pray to a divine mother can have a way they can easily approach the divine. It's good that there's traditions with different languages, different cultural customs, because people live in a different way and they have different worldview. In Japan, in China, in Africa, in America. We shouldn't try to make everyone the same or to think the same. Some of the beauty of Hinduism is there's a great amount of diversity of beliefs and practices. There's so many different forms of the divine. Even within Shri Vidya, there's many different goddesses we can focus our worship on. There's Tripura Sundari, Bala Tripura Sundari, also the childlike form of the goddess. But then there's other goddesses like Shamala, like Pratyangira. We can pray to Ganapati. We can pray to Murugan. There's so many different deities, even within just the Shri Vidya tradition. So it's a vast and beautiful tradition that has a space for everybody. No matter what your level of knowledge is, your level of awareness is, no matter what your level of dedication to your spiritual practice is, everyone can pray. Everyone can come closer to the divine. Everyone is welcome. It doesn't matter what thing you've done in the world. Nothing is evil. All is within the will of God, the Creator. God has willed that some souls will be struggling now in Maya, in ignorance, and some will be more enlightened. Probably if you're listening to this video, you're inclined towards spirituality, and maybe you're a little bit more enlightened, a little bit more blessed. But that's no reason to look down on anyone else or think that you're better or that your tradition is the best or the most accurate. Different paths for different people in different places have been very helpful to bring them close to God. I've said, a lot of bad about the Christians, what the Christians have done, but I've met a lot of very good Christians who've been inspired to do very good deeds and be wonderful people by their Christian tradition. Same with Islam, same with all the other major traditions. We have no need to say that our tradition is better, but it is a wonderful and ancient tradition. It's given so much. I want to help give back just a little bit by sharing a little bit of what I've learned. So we'll continue the reading. We finished the preface today, and we'll go into the first section of the text, which is on the teachings next time that we read. The teaching of who is the goddess. How do we approach the goddess? All this kind of thing. It's a beautiful thing because it's a very experiential practice. You don't have to take my word for it. You can do the practice and see if it's true what I'm saying. It may not be true. You may have your own perspective, and that's fine. I'm not trying to convince you. Just try to share a little bit from my experience, from what my teachers taught me and that sort of thing. A beautiful thing to open up to the experience of the divine. So how do we do that? What do the tantras say? What does this tradition of Shri Vidya say? That's what we'll continue talking. All right. Thanks for watching. Om.